Next from Chicago, we sit down with Roy Norton, the Consul-General of Canada, and discuss the importance of trade between Canada and Illinois and the future of Canada's oil trade now that President Obama has vetoed the Keystone Pipeline. This runs about 35 minutes.
Roy Norton, Canadian Consul-General, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Great to be with you, Terry. Thank you very much for having me.
There's a lot of people I think don't appreciate all that Illinois does in terms of business and trade with Canada. I think many times when I speak with people, they're surprised to find out that Canada is actually Illinois' #1 trading partner, and that we do more trade with Alberta, Canada than with any state in the nation. We're going to talk a lot about trade and some of how our governments and our states, Canadian government and as a country and Illinois merge. But tell us first, just as the Consul General and as the consulate that you have here in Chicago, what kind of a territory do you cover and what actually is the job function?
Well, we cover the states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri, Northwest Indiana as well. And the function is to promote Canadian interests, broadly defined, in those areas. I used to do this job east of here in Detroit, in the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. So, in fact, my Midwestern convictions and bona fides, I guess, have simply been reinforced as a result of this assignment. We promote business. We try to facilitate Canadian exporters accessing sourcing opportunities, building supply chain relationships in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri. We try to promote investment, principally to Canada, although we aren't prohibited from helping Canadian firms invest in this territory. Our U.S. commercial service counterparts, by contrast, are prohibited. They cannot offer assistance to U.S. firms wanting to invest in Canada. We try to promote research and development partnerships, and those could sometimes be between universities or between universities and think tanks or private sector organizations. And then we advocate on a number of issues that are of important to Canadian interests. Those could be matters of protectionist policies, oftentimes at the national level. And in Illinois, we'll talk to national legislators from Illinois, but also to state legislators, the state administration. A case in point, agricultural protectionism. There's one particular issue right now called country of origin labeling. But if Buy American legislation in government procurement, let's say, were introduced in the Illinois legislature, we would intervene. We've actually intervened in the past to try to impress on those who are advocating for such legislation that it probably is bad for Illinois businesses, given the extent to which they're integrated with Canadian businesses, as it would be for Canadian businesses. And we also point out the obvious, I think, that oftentimes such legislation isn't developed with Canada in mind. Maybe it's China, maybe it's another country, but we get sideswiped. And when Canada gets sideswiped, given the amount of trade that we do, that often hurts Illinois businesses as much as it does Canadian ones. So those are the sorts of things that we advocate on, as well as business promotion that I was referring to earlier.
You know, you remind me the other day the Illinois Channel were taping Donald Trump when he spoke in Springfield, and he was mentioning how much the United States, in his opinion, is losing out on different trade balances with different countries, and he was alleging that he would put a tariff on some of these different countries and products. Why is that a bad thing?
Well, the United States has a non-energy trade surplus with Canada, actually. If the United States were to do that universally, it might provoke retaliation on the part of Canada. And maybe that wouldn't bother Mr. Trump, I don't know. But in reality, given that the United States sells more to Canada than it does to anybody else in the world, and we can get into some of those details if you want, I would think you wouldn't want to hurt your best customer. So we'll see whether that goes anywhere or not, or whether it's just rhetoric for campaign purposes. I don't think Mr. Trump has identified Canada when he's talked about that issue or about the border or anything else. He has, by name, identified some other countries, however.
Well, and I think, to the credit of Canadian-U.S. relations, I think the fact is our Canadian allies are so close to us that often Americans take them for granted or tend not to have to think about them because we never have a problem with Canada. Our two people are so similar, I think, as far as culture in different ways. There's certainly some differences, but I mean, we get along so well. But interestingly, I know from speaking with some of your predecessors, Canada does something like 3 times as much trade with Illinois as it does with Mexico. And if I remember the numbers are approximately right, somewhere in the area of 200 to 250,000 Illinoisans are employed directly because of trade with Canada.
Yeah. The number that we use is 344,000, actually, Illinoisans whose jobs depend on trade and investment with Canada. So, I mean, this is 1/3 people. This is more than 5% of the Illinois workforce. And not that that trade is ever likely to stop overnight, but imagine, for the sake of argument, that it did. Imagine that the border were to seize up or there were to be some catastrophe that caused all Illinois-Canada trade to halt, to come to a halt. The unemployment rate in Illinois would double overnight. That would be pretty newsworthy. We don't like to be newsworthy. We rather prefer, back to your point earlier, Terry, Canada doesn't try to cause problems for the United States. By contrast, we are the United States' closest ally, best friend, and partner in most anything that the United States engages in. We're a partner right now in the campaign in the Middle East against ISIL, for example. And the Prime Minister in his meetings with the President has reaffirmed that Canada intends to continue to be a partner with the United States in that effort.
I want to get into some of those, but I want to stay with trade just
Okay.
for a moment. One of the reasons that we do, as a state, so much trade with Canada is because of Canadian oil, and it comes from the tar sands of Alberta. We already have pipelines coming in. A lot of Illinoisans don't realize that Illinois is the 4th largest refining state, and so we import a lot of that oil to refine it here. One of the contentious issues of late, and for 6 years, has been the Keystone Pipeline that the President just really, or recently I should say, turned down. I take it that was a grave disappointment to the Canadian government. Where do you go from here on that issue? And I think is what a lot of people tried to point out, the Canadians are not going to just keep that oil in the ground, whether or not the Keystone Pipeline was built.
Well, there are a number of different responses to that question. Indeed, you are a key refining state. I visited the refineries in Robinson, in Wood River, in Lamont, and other refineries in this territory as well. And they all depend very heavily on Canadian feedstock. They've made massive investments, actually, so as to be able to focus their production capability precisely on Canadian feedstock, and they don't have alternative sources of supply. You know, it's said that more than half of the gasoline consumed on the streets of Chicago derives from Canadian oil, making it obviously a pretty important partnership. And folks in Illinois, in my assessment, understand that, as in they understand that the oil is needed, that it's consumed, and that clearly it's got to get to Illinois and the United States somehow. There are a lot of pipelines now. There was this proposal, of course, to build the KXL pipeline that's recently been rejected. There are 70 pipelines that cross the U.S.-Canada border currently. All of them 7-0, all of them permitted over time, usually taking no more than 3 years for the approval process to be completed, and sometimes changes had to be made to the application and so on. But TransCanada has said they'll come back at another time. Other companies propose pipelines, but the oil is moving in any event by rail. In 2010, in North America, something in the order of 50,000 barrels of oil moved in North America every day by train. 50,000 barrels of oil would be like a 50-car train. And in 2014, it was more than 1 million barrels of oil. That's 10 100-car trains moving around North America. And because Chicago is such a, and Illinois for that matter, the whole state is such a transportation hub, a lot of those trains move through communities in this state, which is of obvious concern, which I think is probably why Illinoisans, maybe more than most folks, were okay with pipelines. As between pipelines and trains, they think realistically it makes more sense to move oil by pipeline.
You know, ironically, in fact, the day after the president said he wasn't going to go with the Keystone Pipeline, there was a rail derailment just in the Quad Cities area, which some of the critics have said there's illustrates the dangers of moving oil by rail as far as environmental reasons.
All of that oil was from the Bakken field, i.e. the U.S. oil from North Dakota. Interestingly, some of that oil, logically, would have gone on KXL because the KXL pipeline would have carried 830,000 barrels.
And that's the Keystone XL pipeline.
The Keystone XL pipeline would have carried 830,000 barrels, slightly more than 100,000 of which, maybe 130,000, would have been American oil from the Bakken. So, which is currently landlocked.
And when you say that, you're talking about a day.
A day.
A day.
Yeah, every day. So that's a 130-car train of Bakken oil that would have gone otherwise in the KXL pipeline that instead is moving by train.
You know, interestingly though, on the area of environmental and energy usage, one of the statistics, as we taped this, you had just given an address to a group of people here in Chicago. I was interested because Illinois is a great producer of coal, and most of the states are using coal as the fundamental provider of energy for the production of electricity. You had said that's, if I have this right, 79% of Canadian energy is non-emitting?
Of Canadian electricity.
Of electricity. Yeah.
Is generated from non-emitting sources.
And by non-emitting, you mean?
I mean hydro and nuclear, as well as wind and solar.
That's an amazing statistic. I've never heard of anyone else having that high of a number.
Well, it's pretty impressive, but obviously we're blessed in Canada with vast hydropower sources. And that, frankly, can be one of the solutions to the United States', including Illinois' needs going forward. Illinois and other states that generate a lot of electricity from coal are going to have to move, at least the EPA wants them to move, towards more and more non-emitting generation. And they're going to have to look, obviously, at the most economical way of getting there. And it could well be that Canadian hydropower will prove to be among the most economical ways for Illinois to achieve its requirements, its targets, while moving off of coal-fired generation.
Just before I leave for permanently the whole issue of oil and all, is Canada now with the XL not, or at least on hold until after the Obama administration, let's put it that way. Are you looking to sell some of that oil to the Chinese? Are they going to be, I had heard something about possibility of there being a new port built on the west coast of Canada.
Well, there are a number of countries, private sector and public sector, that have expressed an interest. The Indians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans all want access to that oil. We are likely to build pipeline capacity to the east coast of Canada in light of the decision on the KXL pipeline, and to ship that oil then to India through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal across the Arabian Sea. But as well, options are certainly under consideration of shipping more oil across British Columbia, perhaps to the port of Vancouver, where currently a lot of oil is already shipped, and that could go to China or Japan or Korea. So there are a number of different options. The oil sands is a very rich development. The oil sands, currently in terms of economic consequence, equates with 2.5% of Canada's GDP. And to give you a comparative, the entire U.S. agricultural industry is 2.5% of your GDP. So we're not about to casually close down the oil sands. It would be silly. We think it can be developed even more responsibly than what it has in the past. It's not as if countries, including the United States, aren't using the oil. You are importing 7 to 8 million barrels of oil every day, and even President Obama's administration says that in 2040 you'll still import on net 6 to 7 million barrels a day. So the issue might reduce for some. Where do you prefer to buy it from? And we offer ourselves as, I think, a pretty logical and rational choice relative to all of the other options.
And obviously, security-wise, we're not facing the Arab oil embargoes we did back in 1973 to have Canadian oil coming to us.
Well, there's security reasons, there's economic reasons, there are environmental reasons. Like, it makes more sense to ship oil the shortest possible distance and not risk tankers breaking up on the high seas, for example. Again, it's not as if you aren't using the oil. And certainly nobody in Canada is saying to the United States, we want a guarantee in perpetuity that you'll buy X quantity of our oil. We're simply saying, as long as you're buying it, you did tell us, after all, in NAFTA that you wanted it. We provisioned to sell it to you, and we would like to be able to fulfill that bargain. The oil sands is developed by many U.S. companies, as in, there are more than 100 Illinois companies that sell into the oil sands, that sell goods and services and technology, and that's created way more than 10,000 jobs in the state of Illinois just as a result of Illinois involvement in the oil sands. It's a mutually beneficial proposition.
So Illinois imports an awful lot of energy, as we've
Yes,
already said.
it's our biggest
What are some of the
single-
products that Illinois exports to Canada?
Well, mostly manufactured goods, actually. A lot of automotive parts, for example. You have a surplus of about $500 million in the amount of automotive parts that you export to Canada. The North American automotive production industry is really totally integrated between our two countries, and parts go back and forth. I used to experience this even more in Detroit, for obvious reasons perhaps, than I do now. But a lot of Illinois companies sell parts, components that will go into Canadian assembly and emerge on the Canadian side of the border as the completed product, perhaps for consumption in Canada, perhaps for export to third countries, perhaps for re-export to the United States. It is among the largest single products. But you sell more than $1 billion in agricultural products to Canada each year, and you've got a considerable surplus with Canada when it comes to agricultural trade. So it's a pretty robust. Tourism is considered an export. There are almost 1 million Canadians that visit Illinois each year.
I would imagine quite a number come here to Chicago.
Well, I think safe to say likely more come to Chicago than anywhere else, but people venture beyond Chicago as well, and they tend to just spend a fair bit of money. And there are direct flights, non-stop flights between Chicago and quite a few Canadian cities, not just Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, but Winnipeg and Calgary and Vancouver, for example. It's easy to visit Canada, and it's easy for Canadians to visit Illinois and Chicago, and we like to do that.
It's interesting, again, in your talk, if we take the whole United States, you represent, or your consulate represents, I should say, 3 states, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri, but trade between the United States and Canada in total, $759 billion.
Last year, yep.
Incredible. And that the Illinois' trade with Canada, to use your numbers, 32% of what Illinois sells to the global marketplace.
Illinois-Canada trade last year was more than $70 billion, two-way. The biggest single component of it is energy that you import. As I said, you take energy out, you enjoy a surplus when it comes to manufactured goods. Illinois sells more to Canada than you do to your next 6 best customers in the world put together. And those, as I recall, are Mexico and China and the United Kingdom and Japan and Australia among them. And those countries have a population between them of 1.7 billion people. And we 35 million Canadians buy more from Illinois than those 1.7 billion people in those other 6 next best customers globally. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Every Canadian is obviously buying a lot of Illinois goods and services. And you make quality things, no complaint in Canada. You know, we can't get enough of it, clearly. So keep it coming. It's a mutual win for Illinoisans and for Canadians.
As I often, excuse me, as I often point out to people, you don't do a trade unless it's mutually beneficial.
Yeah. Well, that's what business people figure out very early. There's an opportunity there for win-win, for a deal that benefits everybody, and there are other considerations that come into account. The transportation capability to move those products to market, and given the significant footprint of Canadian railways, for example, in Illinois, obviously, and the growing footprint, for that matter, there's obviously capacity to move product to Canada, and for that matter, through Canada, to the east and west coast ports of Canada and to the rest of the world. You know, our ports are much less congested than U.S. east and west coast ports. We're closer geographically to the Northeast Asia market and to the European market, as in our coastal ports are. And our ports tend to stay open, whereas oftentimes yours are on strike on the east and west coasts. And so there just seem to be so many reasons to consider shipping through Canada via railways. They happen to be Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, that head north across the border and then go east and west.
Let's talk to, as we tape this in the middle of November 2015, you just had a change of government after 9 years of the Conservatives being in power. The Labour Party came, and we have, I think, now the youngest Prime Minister ever in the history of Canada, if I'm not mistaken, Mr.
No,
Trudeau.
the second youngest. The youngest was Joe Clark, who actually beat Justin Trudeau's father in 1979. He didn't stay in government for long.
I remember that. He was like
months.
3 months Prime Minister, wasn't he?
No, 9 months.
Oh,
And from precisely May of 1979 until February of 1980. But he was 39 years of age when he became Prime Minister.
And Mr. Trudeau, as we just mentioned, his father was, people may remember Prime Minister Trudeau from, I guess, the 1960s and late 70s. He was actually Prime Minister, if I recall, twice, wasn't he?
He was Prime Minister from 1968 until 1984, with that, so 1968 to 79, and then 80 to 84.
That 9 month
Yeah.
gap in there. How will, if in any way, the Canadian government change under the Labour Party, and to what extent does that impact your duties as Consul General in Chicago?
Well, it's the Liberal Party, just to be precise, and the Liberal Party has been the dominant political party in Canada through most of our history, actually. So it's not uncommon, by any stretch of the imagination, to have the Liberal Party in power. It's a centrist party, centrist progressive party that committed that it wouldn't cut the corporate tax rate, which is already the second most attractive to business anywhere in the G7. It's 26%. The United States comparative rate is 39%. They've said that they believe in trade, as in trade liberalization. The agriculture minister looked at the Trans-Pacific Partnership proposal and said he saw nothing there that he would vote against, that would cause him to vote against it. That's not yet the government's official policy, but obviously agriculture was one of the big subjects in that negotiation. So the signals seem to be that the government is going to be consistent on trade liberalization issues, is going to be consistent in terms of the business climate in Canada. And these are things that you asked how this will affect us and our mandate. These are the sorts of things we talk about. I mean, we're trying to promote a sense among American businesses that Canada is a very attractive place from which to do business. And on the scores or the fronts that I've just mentioned, I don't think there's going to be any significant change at all.
One of the hot issues as we sit here is a discussion within the United States of whether we should allow Syrian immigrants to come. We'll talk about national security issues. Canada's long been a strong ally of the United States, not just economically, but militarily. We're all in the Western nations fighting the ISIS threat. In fact, just as we taped this, just about a half an hour ago, the U.S. House passed a bill that would say the Syrians can't come in until our security people have authorized and said that they are, in fact, okay to come in. What is the policy of the Canadian government vis-a-vis allowing Syrian immigrants in, and to what extent are you going to be vetting them?
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody, your country or ours, ever talked about letting anybody in until they were thoroughly vetted. So I'm not sure what the impact of the legislation that you just referenced will be. We have a history in Canada, a tradition of accepting refugees, much like the United States does. We obviously are going to very thoroughly vet the refugees that will come under the program that the government has proposed, that program being to welcome 25,000 refugees from Syria. The previous government had proposed to accept 10,000, which is the same number that the U.S. Has committed to, that President Obama has committed to. We're talking about 25,000, but we're not going to do anything that would cause any anxiety in the United States, obviously.
Let me just anticipate a little anxiety. There's been a raging debate just within the country, and one of the things where I've never heard a good answer for it, how are we going to vet these people? And some have said, well, that's going to take 2 years. It's a thorough process. As I understand it, though, the Canadian government would take in 25,000, what, by the end of the year?
The commitment during the election campaign was to take in 25,000 by the end of the year. They're now grappling with how to do that, and I'm sure there's a fair bit of learning along the way, and there may be a discovery of the fact that it's harder than one might have thought. We'll see. But taking them in and integrating them to society are two different things. They've publicly speculated, the new government has, that one of the options, for example, might be to bring people to Canadian Air Force bases and to house them on the Air Force base while the vetting process continues, and only after the vetting is complete would they be allowed to enter Canadian society. So, i.e. keep people in a secure zone, but obviously a secure zone in a Canadian Air Force base is a good deal more secure from the point of view of the individual who is at risk of death, potentially, either in Syria or in refugee camps in the Middle East region. Keep them alive, provide them with health care, with food, with shelter, while they're being vetted. But if the vetting comes up negatively, you can be sure that none of those people are going to end up in Canada. They'll be sent back where they came from.
So the bottom line is, while Americans have been, over the years, concerned about the porous nature of our southern border, we haven't at all had any fears about our Canadian border, and you would say we won't.
And you have no reason, you've had no reason to be fearful of your Canadian border. You know, there have been no terrorist attacks in either of our countries perpetrated by people who came across the border from the other country. And you will have no reason to be concerned about your northern border going forward.
Before we close out, just tell us a little bit about yourself and where'd you grow up, and what's your professional background prior to becoming the Consul General of Chicago?
I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, our capital, sort of like growing up in Washington, D.C., but a microcosm, as it were. Got involved in our Canadian Parliament when I graduated from university in Ottawa the first time. worked in our House of Commons and our Senate for members of those chambers, and then worked for 5 years for our foreign minister, our equivalent to your Secretary of State, as his senior policy advisor. After that, I joined the bureaucracy, as in our State Department, and got posted to Washington, served there for 4 years in the economic section of our embassy, worked on as a member of our negotiating team for a couple of NAFTA chapters, the investment and intellectual property chapters, which were sort of path-breaking at the time. I then went back and did some more academic studying. It's something that I did every once in a while, and in this case at United States University, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Washington. And then I joined the government of Ontario, where I was responsible for that province's international relations and protocol, and then where I ran the export agency for a couple of years before coming back to Washington as minister, sort of number 3 in our embassy, responsible for our relations with Congress, and then got posted to Detroit to be our Consul General there, where I worked, among other things, on getting agreement from the state of Michigan to build a new bridge between Detroit and Windsor across the Detroit River.
Who paid for that bridge?
Well, Canada is paying for the bridge. So I gave
Donald Trump would be.
my great success in Detroit was to persuade Michiganders that they should accept the gift of a free bridge from Canada, and clearly I did the job okay because I got sent to Chicago. So and here I've been since St. Patrick's Day 2014. That was my first day on the job. I had a choice, and I thought, I'll never forget starting work in Chicago on St. Patrick's Day, and I won't.
Well, Roy Norton, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. I think a lot of Illinoisans maybe don't realize we have something like 80 consulates. We have more consulates than any other state, with the exception of New York with the UN.
Right.
But certainly none are more important to Illinois than Canada, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you.